Good afternoon. Thank you everybody for joining us for this initial look at our SAP 2021 survey. Thank you to everybody who's filled out the survey. It is still live, so if you haven't yet submitted responses, please do go in. I'm Tom Venables. I'm the Director of Turnkey's Application and Cybersecurity Practice. I've been securing SAP systems for coming up on 20 years now, with 13 of those at Turnkey, so been around for a while. And I'm really pleased today to be joined by John and Mel from Anapsys, who are going to share their insights and help me break down what the results might be telling us about securing the modern SAP environment. Welcome, John. Welcome, Mel. Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, definitely. Hi, guys. Thanks for having us, Tom. This is going to be quite an interesting little event, I believe. So I'm Mel. I look after the UK and Ireland for Anapsys, Senior Sales Executive. I'm here to support the guys, but I think it'll be mostly Tom and John for you guys today.
Thanks, Mel. And John?
Hi, Tom. Pleased to be with you today. So yeah, I'm John Cooper. I work at Anapsys as part of the sales engineering team. And I've been working with SAP for the last 20 years or so in different formats, different guises. So yeah, pleased to be with you on the call today. Thanks for having us.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining, guys. Thank you everybody for tuning in. As you're going to see through some of the questions, securing these critical systems is more than just the roles and authorizations in there. I think those of you who've completed it will see there's, I think, only one question which really drills into those. We're looking at some of the more non-traditional elements of SAP security. If your background is like mine, although if you're like John, then you've been looking at these things for a lot longer. We'll be focusing on an increasing need to look at additional elements and to close some of the gaps between the application ownership and the cybersecurity organization and the way that they approach risk and vulnerabilities. So without further ado, I think we'll get in and start taking a look at the results. Assuming I can actually change the slides. I'm looking young there. So we'll be talking a little bit about the evolving threats, what the results mean for you as SAP customers, what people are doing to protect themselves, and focusing on some of the appropriate tooling and the vulnerability management that needs to be in place. So our first question was about custom code and reviewing custom code for security and quality issues. And John, what leapt out to you on the responses from this one?
Yes, good response, actually. I mean, we work with a lot of customers, obviously, looking at specifically custom code. And we find on average customers, SAP customers have, 2.5 million plus lines of custom code. And looking at the analysis of that, we find one vulnerability per 1,000 lines of code. So that works out about 2,500 vulnerabilities. So the key thing there is you need to automate this. You need to automate that process. And there are tools available to help with this process. So yeah, it's interesting to see that when we look at the probably over half, which is good they do, but the first one is it's manual. So again, it's leading to the automation of that, the amount of time that can save, the effort involved, and the fact that it happens on every development cycle, every project, every custom program that's written, is baked into the system. So yeah, that's what I took from that. I mean, and also a thing to consider is to do this early in the whole development cycle. This whole shift left principle is key there. And again, that's back to the automation. So yeah, it's main findings, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things to call out here is that it's not just the security of that code, it's also the quality of it. As we'll see from some of the subsequent questions, there are downtime issues that are associated with poorly configured code or poorly written code. Yeah, I think it's good to see so many people reviewing, but I do take your point. I know how painful it can be to manually scroll through pages and pages about that.
Yeah.
So our second question, as I just alluded to, downtime as a result of a coding issue. I was quite encouraged to see that 50% not attributing downtime to coding issues, but I was quite surprised how many people were honest about this level of downtime that they're seeing.
Yeah, Yeah, one thing from the analysis, we do find that in those types of code vulnerability we see is things like ABAP command injection. So within a standard filter section, you can type or inject code. You can do OS command injections as well. And almost all of the findings, nearly 100% we find missing or broken auth checks. So that can lead to things like directory traversal, cross-site scripting. We see more DB mods, so you can, format a drive, which would be, catastrophic, which would lead to a downtime. But more recently, we've seen, it used to be quite small, but it's growing now, this cross-site scripting from web front-end clients, which is more common now with the Fiori. So yeah, we do see it will ultimately lead to downtime, unfortunately.
Yeah, and something that I've just remembered that I forgot to do in the introduction is if anybody has any questions, please do add them into the Q&A section. We'll try and address any questions towards the end. I think that's really interesting, John, that we're seeing an increase in sort of the maturity of the attacks against SAP, especially from these external sort of facing applications where people are at a code level able to exploit vulnerabilities within the system that are completely invisible to security administrators. So, a few years ago, I was building roles and administering users and probably completely unaware that these vulnerabilities existed. But they not only exist, there's people out there who can exploit them, and that's an increasing threat vector to the SAP.
Yeah, sure.
That's insightful. So the third question drills into that a little bit more to talk about whether it's in-house or third-party developed code. And I think it's telling that customers don't seem to trust, which is good. I mean, we're talking about a zero trust approach to security throughout this survey. For anyone who's not familiar with that terminology, that assumes that your systems are going to be attacked and that your perimeter is going to be breached. And therefore, you need to control your authorizations that people can exploit within the system, but also completely control the vulnerabilities that are easily exploitable within that. So it's good that people are starting to take that zero trust approach. What leapt out to you on this one?
I suppose over the 50% of no's, and that that may be down to business pressures, lack of resource, could be also due to the fact that the distributed nature of the dev teams now. If it's in-house, if it's contractors, is it an SI, nearshore, offshore resources all play a part in this, and it will have been developed over years. So yeah, that's kind of what stood out for me, I think, Tom.
I think what's quite key here is you've got quite a high number of not sures as well. And is that a case that they don't know, it's not part of their process, or is it actually, it fits into someone else's responsibility, and therefore, there's this unknown? So, is this an area that is being missed, or is this an area that is quality controlled in itself from a process point of view?
Yeah, it's really important. We do often ignore the sort of people and process elements of securing our systems, focusing so much on the technology. And I think, John, you called out a really important part there. More and more third parties are involved in the governance of these systems. You see a lot less in-house basis resource now and managed service agreements with MSPs out in the industry. So you've got less visibility generally of what might be making its way into the systems. And I think, Mel, that speaks to your point of just how much visibility is there of these. So yeah, quite interesting, and I think something that I'd like to drill into more with some of our customers to understand that not sure element as well.
Yeah, good.
So question 4 expands on that. Have you got a way to identify that insecure or problematic code before it hits prod? Hopefully everybody's mature enough now to be observing the correct change controls around their SAP estate. But are they folding those change controls in? And with a third of respondents not really having that sort of gating checkpoint, I think it tallies with the responses that we've seen so far, that about 30% are struggling with that element. And as you said, I think it might be resource requirement. It might be capability. We know there's a skill shortage of various skill sets out there, especially in the security space. What's a good way to introduce that sort of stage gating, do you think?
I suppose really, ideally, if you can form some part of DevSecOps initiative and tools and automation to help with that, and tools and processes are in place to automate those checks prior to releasing code downstream into those downstream environments. And this also is not just the code checks, it's also things like transport requests as well, which may include code checks and also objects which need to be checked prior to that release downstream. But again, probably the reason why we've got some no's that are quite high no's is because the pressures around releasing those are often released around specific windows. Certainly when I was working on these types of projects, it'd be out of hours, evenings, weekly release schedules, or out of hours at the weekend. So if you can try and reduce those through something like DevSecOps initiatives, that's great. It also reduced downtime, which was mentioned, I think, earlier. So we do have actually an interest in DevSecOps for S4 migrations to download. It's a book on initiatives you can deploy. So it could be worth a read. It could help people out there if they're interested in this.
Excellent. Yeah, really good. And I think one of the things I would fold into that is integrating with your change control systems. So we're seeing a lot of applications now where there are APIs developed so that you can plug into things like ServiceNow for change management, and you can effectively automate a lot of your stage gate approvals through the workflows in there, but incorporate these automated checks through tooling like CodeProfiler, etc. Yeah, it all results in a much more secure production environment. Question 5 was an interesting one for me. I have a little bit of history with some large and complex environments where I've seen interface mapping be something of a challenge. I was quite encouraged to see 70%, or as near as makes no odds, of our customers seem to have a good handle on their interfaces and their landscape topography. But a quarter of people not being able to, or not sure if they're able to map all of their interfaces. What does that tell you?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I say, it's good that it's almost 70% yes can. It'd be interesting to know how often that happens and how much effort that takes. And the no's are of concern, as you mentioned. There's no denying that the IT landscape has become more complex as we become more connected. We are hyper connected. We move from that traditional, when I started in the 90s with SAP, traditional behind the firewall siloed environment, to adopting the cloud solutions, SaaS products. There's many SAP SaaS applications out there. You look at HR for HCM, for example, SuccessFactors, Workday, Fieldglass, and then you've got things like Ariba, Concur. There's many considerations, complexities, and interfaces to consider. Even with the CRM, Salesforce is very commonly used and adopted. The C4HANA now, again, another example of all the interconnections at play. So yeah, it's interesting to see that, those no's and not sure's. Yeah,
definitely. And I think one of the items that you called out there, that those yeses, I would like to drill into those to see how long that takes, and to see what the effort expended in these sort of system audits or population of configuration management databases or asset registers, how long that takes. I think the final piece that I always think about with this is shadow IT. It's so easy now to spin up a system in the cloud for a local finance director in a multinational organization. And all of a sudden, you've got a Salesforce system that is local, but they want to interface to SAP. And the first time you see it is when they make that connection request, because you've got far less central governance over that procurement and that journey.
Yeah, traditionally, that is the role of basis, who are often under pressure with their lights on as well, service. So to load them up with this additional requirement is quite challenging. And as we become more diverse, more complex, we also more connected. We find that with this specialist, like I say, applications and skills, and also with that security considerations to consider. So yeah, these are all problems to try and drill into.
Yeah, and I suppose our challenge is making that easier for the application owners in the long run to validate the security and the vulnerabilities of that estate.
Yeah.
It's certainly keeping us young, isn't it? So this one, again, I find this quite encouraging. I think there might be a slight sampling bias amongst our customers and in this space, because we certainly do get people to try and take it a little bit seriously. And Turnkey being the GRC specialists that we are, we would expect people to have these tooling. But we've still got quite a lot of manual review of user authorizations and the roles in SAP. It's still a critical part of securing that application layer. I think manual review, I've proven on implementations that it can take months longer than an automated system. What I would like to drill into more on this is how integrated that is with other solutions and how they tie that sort of risk profile together. Because as I say, you know, a lot of these questions are focused on much more than just the roles and authorizations. Whether or not those GRC toolings, whether it's SAP GRC or a third party or even the manual ones, do they feed that into a wider risk management picture? And do they also incorporate their vulnerability management data into that to say, okay, you're 60% compliant on your segregation of duties or your sensitive access risks, but actually you've got a load of coding vulnerabilities in there. So it doesn't matter how secure your roles are, because anybody can come in with this unsecured HTTP connection to your SAP environment and start remotely executing function modules within those estates.
Yeah, there's, like you said, Tom, there's some solid SAP GRC tools now available and mature to help with this and automate this process. One thing to kind of consider now is audit is traditionally focused on roles, auths, SODs, and those kind of are taking care of themselves more now with those tools we've mentioned and you've mentioned. But the other thing, often not in that test catalog, is to think about things like the configuration settings, the parameter settings, patching, code, as we've talked about, integrations, which we just mentioned. All those things now are very much SAP or application specific requirements that should be considered and monitored. So yeah, it's going beyond roles and auths and SODs. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's nice to see people taking this element so seriously. I think if we can get to that sort of 60-70% with the vulnerability management as well, we'll start to be looking at much more security rather than compliance. The two are closely linked, but not necessarily synonymous. So I think it's quite easy for people to say, yeah, I've got a tool that does that, and so it's secured, but not necessarily look at security as a concept as a whole. Funnily enough, you just segued us nicely into the next one, talking about the configuration of the systems. I recently reviewed an S4 implementation. I shan't mention who did it, but the audit logging wasn't switched on. And those kind of things are a bit of a red flag to me as to the quality of that whole implementation from a security standpoint. I think it's quite encouraging to see over half of our respondents are consistently applying these configuration standards. I would imagine that they've also got good development standards within their environments. They're clearly taking it seriously. But with a third, 40% in fact, of either inconsistent application of that or not having those standards at all, I think that does speak to what you were talking about with the configuration. And what leaps out at you in terms of your experience seeing these in the wild, as it were?
Yeah, I suppose it's not seen as a one-off, and it has to be, that config drift has to be checked and should be checked. So you can monitor that. And also those logs have to be, can generate high volumes, and there's a process required to turn that raw data and logs into information and identify outliers, which is consuming. So again, that's back to the automation piece and tools to assist with that.
And I think, Mel, this is one of those areas where a good process can help address this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was going to say, in terms of you know, we've certainly got tools that allow you to almost track changes as and when they're done. So, you know, we have alerting and monitoring tools, but actually a lot of our customers use them for change management and tracking as well. So it's a really, really good way of making sure that, you know, that 30% at the top where they have, you know, they understand that the configuration standards are there, but they haven't, you know, they see that they're not consistently met. These kind of things can be added to the rules and you know, regulations to be checked upon, and you can see what's been done and what's not. So yeah, lots around that side of things to add to the process side.
Yeah, and turning that detective control that might be periodic, you know, once a quarter we review that the configuration is in alignment. You can turn that into much more of a preventative control if you're actively monitoring it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the point about too much data is quite an important one as well. It's not enough to have switched the logging on. It's what are you doing with it, and how mature are you with the handling of those alerts and that generation.
Yeah.
My favorite question on our survey this year. Lots and lots of scope for people to interpret, but I think it's less prevalent than it was when I started out. But I think you do sort of see people treat SAP as being completely within the firewalls and therefore a little bit less vulnerable than maybe some of your internet-facing systems. That's changing, obviously, with the move towards systems like S/4HANA and more web-enabled content. But I thought this one was quite a good way to see what people's attitude to SAP was. I think people, 18 and a bit % agree with the statement it's within the network, so it's secured against cyber threats. I don't think it's a surprise to me, but I think it represents a slightly older view of what an SAP estate is and what the network perimeter is. Mel, I know you've done a lot with perimeter security in the past.
Yeah, so my past is predominantly perimeter security, and it still amazes me that this is a kind of focal point for areas of, I guess, this lack of the unknown rather than a concern of, you know, what they do know. But actually, you know, perimeters, yes, of course, are secure, and everybody has a product somewhere that does everything. But I mean, there's always gaps. There's always something available. And actually, you know, I mean, even if you do consider that it is secure, can you say that this particular area at SAP has not been affected by a breach somewhere else within the network? Do you have the tools to actually prove that that's the case, that these are actually still monitored fine, audited fine, you know, and can see any kind of threat, attack, or anything from the internal, external perimeter side of things? So, you know, I think I would hope that the people that are saying yes, that it's in and it's contained and it's fine, have the tools to be able to monitor the SAP environment to make sure that that is the case. You know, do they see that it's successful and you know, they have no ability to have any kind of attack? I think majority of those yeses also will say that they're not internet facing, and like you said, with the changes that are coming up and, you know, S/4HANA and things like that, you know, everything nowadays is web enabled in some form. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, even downloading patches to your SAP estate, you've got to open a connection to the web via Solution Manager and go and get those elements. So there's always some connectivity between these systems.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is what you mentioned earlier about the zero trust, Tom. So trust no one, even people inside the network. So, and that's because the surface area of attack has exploded over the last decade, you know. People don't work behind the traditional corporate firewall, so probably why people are saying no there. And this has been happening for years through, you know, bringing BYOD, remote workforces, adoption of SaaS, mobile, public Wi-Fi's, IoT and supply chain. And it's certainly hockey sticked 12 months ago when pretty much 90+% of the population have to work from home through usually an unsecured Wi-Fi. So yeah, it needs not just that classic perimeter protection, but an application specific focus.
Absolutely. And I think the The other thing to bear in mind is how mature those cyber threats are getting now. You know, the APTs that are identified in sort of cyber threat intelligence initiatives, they're employing SAP specialists who are just as good, if not better, as some of the best basis guys I've worked with in terms of being able to patch systems and hide their footprints once they've penetrated. They're automatically scanning for vulnerabilities. There's evidence that they closely monitor the sort of vulnerability publishing things. I know Anapsys are very good at making customers and SAP themselves aware of zero-day exploits like Recon and the Solman ones that were published last year. And that information is critical to the consumer, but equally valuable to people who want to misuse it. And the capabilities that they have to identify those and to exploit them is genuinely quite frightening when you realize what they're able to do. I think it's an insightful question, and I find it interesting, Mel, that you read the yes as being people confident in their detect and respond elements of NIST, whereas I initially read that as people, you know, agreeing with the statement is more along the lines of, we don't think this is a threat, whereas you think they're probably thinking, yes, it is a threat, but we're already managing that threat.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's quite it can be read different ways, I guess. So it would be interesting to again drill down to the customers that have answered this and say, you know, is this how it was interpreted, and is that why we've got so many no's? And yeah, very good point.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to get together in once lockdown ends and we can meet up in a restaurant or something and just hash this one out with people.
Yeah, maybe we
be long now, hopefully.
Yeah. And I think the question 9 sort of supplements that one quite a little bit. We still see a lot of people very concerned about that insider threat, the internal risk of fraud. And of course, it is a threat to our SAP systems. But I was quite encouraged to see quite a big uptick in the data loss or breach elements, because that's what a lot of these ransomware attacks and the malicious actors are doing, is either trying to exfiltrate data and misuse it. In fact, there was a news story today about a gun owner's website that was hacked and the user details leaked. Those kind of things are quite dangerous, and the reputational damage. It's quite a good mix of threats there. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I mean, people obviously realize now that the crown jewels are in SAP and ERP systems and CRM systems. So, and that sensitive data is not just compliance related around GDPR and PCI, etc. It's intellectual property that can be found in like bombs, routings, recipes, price lists, financial information, and designs, drawings. These can all be attached as documents in the DMS system of SAP. So, and this ultimately is what can differentiate you from your competition. So, yeah, it highlights the, you know, the need for risk assessments and where this data resides, and also continuous monitoring of. So, yeah.
I think it ties in line with the question around the authorizations and the management of that, and you know, the roles and duties, and you know, is that a manual process, etc., etc. I mean, if you consider that nearly 41% are most concerned about the internal users, and yet only 30-something% managed that, you know, actively managed that with the tool or manually, then you can consider that this is actually maybe an area that needs, you know, a bit more focus.
Yeah, it's about a prioritization of spend to manage risk, isn't it?
Yeah,
and the system downtime, I suppose, if someone did gain access, an external, so small percentage, then system downtime again is a small percentage. But if they did gain access, the last thing they would do is create a system downtime event, like drop a database, delete a client. They would kind of either go for the data loss, extract the IP, or gain privileged access to silently navigate laterally to defraud the company, which points to the data breach and the internal fraud. So, yeah, it's interesting, that one.
Yeah, that's quite a good point as well. You know, being breached externally doesn't mean that fraud can't be committed. So I suppose you've got that. It appears as an internal fraud, even though the attack came from somewhere else. which is good from the point of view of the controls still addressing some of those risks. But yeah, if you can't stop the people coming in, then you've got a slightly bigger problem. This was, I think, a difficult question for people to answer, although I am quite encouraged to see so many no's on it. You know, I understand in a survey like this, it's probably difficult to say that you've been subjected to a data breach. It's also possible that, you know, people have genuinely not been attacked or had any exfiltration of data. I was surprised at how many people say it doesn't, because I don't think it's backed up by the industry statistics around what we see happen to organizations generally. I think the other thing that this called out to me is something one of my colleagues like to say is, are we good or are we lucky? We haven't suffered this breach. We haven't been victim to one of these attacks. Is that because our controls are operating effectively, or have we just, you know, skated on very, very thin ice and been very, very lucky all the way through? Mel, what was your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I thought this was an interesting one. Again, I mean, we discussed this, you know, offline, and actually, you know, the majority of the audience, I guess, we know, we trust, or have heard of us at some point, and therefore there's some kind of, you know, security focus, and therefore you kind of hope that these no's are protected and verified no's, as in they have a secure environment. I think the yeses are very honest and very, you know, it's very easy to sit back and say no, because you're then the, you know, the focal point for questioning and obviously responsibility. And again, you know, for me, the not sures are quite, it's quite compelling to see the not sures, because, you know, again, is this an ownership issue? Is this because they don't have the ability to monitor? They don't know that there's an issue. They've had a breach internally somewhere, but don't actually know if this particular application has been, you know, targeted to that as well. So yeah, I really like this question, and I really appreciate the honesty within there as well, because, you know, not a lot of people hold their hands up and say, yeah, they've had, you know, they've run into that problem or they've hit that wall. Yeah. So it was good to see. It was good to see a varied response.
Yeah, and I think related to one or more of your SAP systems is quite an esoteric term as well. I know it's easier to secure data at rest in SAP than it is necessarily to secure the emails that have got screenshots of HR databases or customer databases in there. You know, we all dump data into Excel. I still work a lot in Excel, simply because, you know, at a certain point you stop using the transactions and go straight to the tables, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think we all do it.
This was quite an interesting one for me, and John, I'm really keen to get your insight on this, because I know it's close to your heart. Managing the vulnerabilities and the program of vulnerability management, it's not a one-time exercise, right? It's something that you've got to keep on top of. It's good to see, you know, almost 30% of people having that in place. But this one, the no's really leap out as quite a big chunk, and I think I read not sure on this one as probably no. I think if you're effectively managing your vulnerabilities, you know your patching schedules, you know your planned downtime for critical service pack upgrades, etc. It's kind of hard to skate under the radar with an effective vulnerability management program. But what were your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I agree. I did see the not sures and the no's together as quite a negative thing, like almost 3/4 of the response there. So, and the first principle of NIST is to identify, you know, what is your risk posture. And as you mentioned earlier about the hackers, they've evolved over the decade. It's not just, you know, teenagers who, for example, hacked the TalkTalk years ago. It's well-funded, serious organized crime groups. It's nation-state sponsored attacks. Back to the weekend, I was reading the Sunday Times, and on one page, there's 2 articles about this, politically motivated attacks as relationships are souring. Yes, Tuesday, the British Army mentioned that, you know, they're going to cut troops because they're going to focus more on electronic and cyber warfare resources. So, yeah, the first thing is to monitor, and the other thing is to say that this is a continuous journey. It's not just a one-off event. So, it's a continuous journey to identify your risk and identify issues, prioritize and fix, and then put some continuous monitoring in place, look at the DevSecOps initiatives that we mentioned earlier. And then even things like audits, not trying to automate those as well with the compliance checks and regular checks. All this is a journey. It's not just a one-off exercise, and it can happen over time. But yeah, this is very interesting one, this question 11, the results.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've sort of crusaded on and continuing to try and espouse is I see a little bit of a gap between an SAP application owner and a CISO and the management of cyber risk. They're both very focused on risk, but in slightly different ways and with slightly different language. You mentioned NIST there. I think most CISOs are conversant in the NIST pillars of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. I think many SAP application owners don't necessarily think in the same sort of same approaches and aren't necessarily quite as educated as to the maturity of these nation state attackers. I remember reading an article a couple of years ago that they have health programs and dental care and pension plans for these hacker groups now. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's definitely interesting. I think we're seeing a shift towards that, which feeds in nicely into security operation centers and the visibility that they have into SAP with the move towards more web hosting. So your AWS estates, your Azure, your software as a service. A lot more focus is put onto things like SOC 2 reports to demonstrate compliance and security of those environments. And a lot of these SOCs are third-party providers, right? But you mentioned earlier, like the volume of data that SAP is capable of exporting can muddy the water a little bit or make it difficult to see the forest for the trees, as it were. I thought that this was quite a good mix of responses. There's people monitoring and alerting on SAP in isolation, but not necessarily integrating that with their SOC. Do you think more real, and I suppose it feeds the question earlier where we were talking about turning detective controls into preventative controls. SOC alerting can let you know that you've got a problem in near real time, so that you can actually address that before it becomes a big issue, before you do suffer that breach or that data exfiltration. But I thought the no's are still quite a big percentage of this.
Yeah, I agree. It is an interesting mix there. And as you mentioned, it's that reducing the processing time from that noise to value, and also take the vulnerability information from SAP and try and contextualize that with the data available, and as it links to the SIM tools for rapid identification and issue resolution to drive strategic value from those inputs. So there's a lot that can be done there. It's reducing that noise and that time to value, I think, which is again key. Like say, going from detective after the event and usually a long time after the event to closing that gap almost to a near real time is where you get real value.
Absolutely.
I think the complexity of false positives and things like that can be a reason that people maybe keep these away from events and SOC and reporting and things like that, because there can be a lot of false positives, and therefore these can be a manual process, and therefore left out of that kind of visibility, and people don't know what to do with the noise that does come from it. So actually having tools in place that can reduce the number of false positives that come out of it is actually beneficial as well for the assessment process afterwards.
Absolutely. Yeah, that sort of triage and that pattern analysis that lets you say, yeah, that event in isolation, one user trying to log on twice with an incorrect password is not necessarily an indicator of compromise, but 2,000 users all trying to log in from the same terminal with an incorrect password, you might want to take a look at, right?
Somehow means something, yes.
So question 13, the manual review of SAP logs for events. I think this speaks more to those detective controls. It is quite nice to see that there's an increasing percentage of people who have done that SIEM integration and started to achieve some of that automation and that data enrichment that's possible through security incident event monitoring solutions. Still a significant percentage who don't review the SAP logs. I'm assuming that those people do if there is an investigation, but they're not actively monitoring them, is how I read that. Was that your read on it, John?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I mean, it's good, like you say, that nearly 40% are. That's the good news. And also in those logs is a rich source of privilege misuse, which can be interpreted quickly, so.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks back to that point we were making earlier about that timeliness and that efficiency of that. There is automation that you can achieve here to make it much more actionable and much more valuable in terms of real risk reduction. Mm-hmm. Question 14 was an interesting one for me. Are your SAP systems always completely, those are two very declarative terms in there, up to date with the latest patches? We know that patching is critical to address vulnerabilities. You've got to be up to date with the latest security patching or whatever's addressing a 0-day that gets identified, like by your expert team of researchers who, I must confess, have caused me headaches in the past where I've been parachuted into meetings to say, what are we doing about this latest published one? That's not a criticism, by the way, it's really important. I thought 51% surprised me, because I know a lot of customers take a while to patch. What leapt out to you guys on this one?
I mean, it's a difficult one, this one, because it's understandable. You have to obviously plan the downtime in advance, and there's only certain windows and schedules. But we've got, observed threat activity around security notes. And you mentioned earlier, Tom, about Recon, which was a CVSS 10 last year. And what we noticed was within 48 hours of the SAP notes being released, a fully weaponized exploit was available from GitHub as a download, obviously for some Bitcoin. And we've got evidence of people actively exploiting such vulnerabilities out in the wild. So, and you mentioned about the sophistication of the attackers. We've seen people not only access through such vulnerabilities, but then also patch the system so other people can't access through the same route. So, it's real sophisticated skills they have and knowledge. And yeah, there's the nose and the timing involved means that you could be at risk, basically. So there's a real change there, as people have probably realized over the last few years now.
Yeah, I think one of the surprising things is the latency, either of residency of an attacker within a network and between them penetrating and starting to exploit. I think the average around the world is hovering around 180 to 200 and something days that people can be resident within your network and sniffing out vulnerabilities. But also just how quickly they're able to spin these up. As you say, a few days after SAP releasing a patch note, there's a detailed script available for any attacker who wants it. And I think that time to exploit is coming down. So you might think it's fine to say, yeah, we're up to date, we're within 6 months of the latest patch. Actually, that means that you've been vulnerable for 5 months and 27 days to people who could have exploited that.
Yeah.
Question 15 is one that's close to my heart. The user maturity. We know that 93% of successful attacks involves some form of social engineering, some form of exploiting users and their access. And it speaks a little bit to that. We're within our network, therefore we're secure. Well, you're within your network, but the laptops that are connecting to your systems, have they always been within the network? Are they used to go to websites outside of the secured network or unapproved sites? Are all of your users educated to not click on that dodgy link at dodgy.com? I think the average and room for improvement are very honest responses here. I think it's quite good there. It's nice to see people rating their user education programs as good and excellent in places. It is a really important point to close that loop, because not every system is secured. Not every user is as educated as they need to be about the threats that are out there and the ways that people will exploit those. And as a third-party supplier to a number of customers, I'm hyper aware that I need to be really cautious with the IT kit that I've got and not use that to step outside of approved usage, because I could be a backdoor into my customers' accounts. There may be malware present on a device that then gets connected to a VPN that then finds an SAP system with these automated solutions you were talking about, John, of being able to scan and identify and exploit vulnerabilities. I think it's a really important component, and I'm not sure whether, again, that gap between your CISOs who are paying such close attention to these elements and your SAP application owners, do they necessarily see on their risk index where they're looking at internal fraud, are they putting user maturity for cyber threats up there, not necessarily equal to, but certainly on the same risk register?
I think this is a really key point, actually, and very prevalent, with people working from home and, having the accesses and freedom that they have at the moment, multitasking with families and kids and everything that's going on at the moment, as well as dealing with the day-to-day work and the environment that they're working in. There's so many new threat factors now that are coming into place that look very realistic. You've got your work email because you've had a delivery somehow or something, and or maybe even bill related or tax related or something that maybe comes up, or again even professionally, you've got a link to connect to a WebEx that you thought was this person's WebEx link and things like that, and then all of a sudden that user's clicked on something that has then infiltrated their passwords or kind of compromised their position within that security maturity. And like you say, there's companies out there, KnowBe4 and things like this, that are going along educating users for this type of managing risk and things like that. But actually, it depends how convincing it is and how alert you are and how on your mind it is as to how important it is that you are constantly thinking along that route, that safety and security route. We do this in a day-to-day basis. Security is forefront of our mind. Have you been sent a work link that maybe they're testing the environments and you've clicked because you think, of course, and actually you've done it yourself and you think, this is an environment where I know I shouldn't just be clicking links that are coming through and things like that. So, it's a very interesting thing to have that training and the trust in people, but, it's a one-off click. It's a one-off thing to happen. So, are you going to rely on that, or are you going to support it perhaps with some tools in the background that can enforce the fact that you have a high maturity level in that field? Yeah. It's a real interesting one.
Yeah, I think it does come back to that zero trust. You've got to assume that the breach is going to happen.
Yeah, knowledge is key, isn't it? But yeah, you can't help yourself. If you clicked, you've clicked.
Yeah. I still deal with people who email me passwords to systems.
Yeah.
And we've seen recently with all the Exchange breaches that have been hit in the news that email isn't necessarily the most secure way to be doing that.
Yeah, or leave a post-it note with a password to the machine on the machine. Yeah. I've seen that a few times.
I did do an assessment where we were looking at some custom web functionality, and the developers had commented out some lines of the HTML, but they'd put usernames and passwords in those commented fields. Wow. Anybody could hit F12 on their laptop and go and see that,
Yeah, interesting.
Question 16 speaks a little bit about sort of that expansion into a more interconnected and online facing world. S/4HANA, we see a lot of customers undertaking that journey or planning it. We know that the deadline from SAP was extended. I think there's a good mix of responses, and I don't really care too much about the type of implementation. It does speak to how we'll help them secure that as they undertake that journey. But I think only 8% of people not really looking at S4 maybe 18 if you include the not sures in that. That gives us a large percentage of customers who are about to be taking that step into or out of that world where you can say SAP is completely within my network, and far more towards, actually, I've now got HTTPS content, if they're doing it properly, enabled. I've got some new windows into my landscape. I think it's good that people are taking the journey. I think it increases efficiency, but people need to be aware of what that does to their vulnerabilities. John, any thoughts on this? Did anything, were you surprised at any of it?
No, like you say, it is a good mix. And what I took from this is, as I see it, once in a lifetime transformation opportunity for most companies. So use that as a catalyst for change to adopt, the application-centric cyber initiatives we've talked about today. Mm-hmm. So, and also one other thing I did think of with the greenfield, consider that opportunity, what governance and procedures and tools you put in place to stay clean. And for brownfield, how do you get clean in preparation for that, and then reduce that timeline? So that's what I took from that, but it is a good mix. Yeah.
No, that's really important. Are you ready to make that journey is as important as what are you doing as you do that, and can you use that as an opportunity to increase your controls of status? It's a really good point. And often these programs have larger budgets where you can carve out security specific requirements, and you don't have to fight tooth and nail to get a GRC system implemented, or a vulnerability management program, or code scanning, or these smaller tactical pieces of work. You can deal with it at a much more enterprise level.
Yeah, they also have the communication mechanisms in place as well to help with that, which is key.
Yeah, all the business change and engagement elements that are so key to getting those processes in place.
That's it, yeah.
And I think question 17 speaks to much of the same thing. We're seeing more people undertake this digital transformation journey, move into the cloud, move into software as a service models. We've got a significant percentage of people who are already connected to those. Of the no's, I'd like to understand whether that's part of their journey, whether they're seeing that, or whether they're clearly like cloud never approach. But yeah, the software as a service, it's another route in, right? We trust those vendors to secure their systems, but the vendors themselves say there's a very clear difference between security of the cloud and security in the cloud. And they're very, very clear that it's the customer's responsibility to maintain their security posture within those.
Yeah. There's definitely a sort of misunderstanding in terms of, again, ownership from that point of view as to, well, it's a service provided by, Salesforce, et cetera, and therefore, they have security implemented it throughout, and they do, yes, that's to stop people getting to that infrastructure, not necessarily getting to your data, which is quite key. We've seen quite a few questions on here as well, Tom, so I don't know how much more time you want to give to that.
I think we've only got one more to go through. So
just on that last one as well. I mean, cloud providers have a real focus on security. They call it job zero. So I think the ERP has to catch up with that concept. But there are tools, as there are with cloud, to help with that whole process that we've discussed.
Yeah, I think they've embraced that zero trust approach from the outset. They've built with that in mind. I think the on-premise ERPs, I think you're absolutely right. We're still catching up, and in a lot of cases, still catching up with the attackers in some of these areas. And the final question was, who's responsible for this within your organization? And I see IT as de facto risk owners a lot of the time, especially in the GRC space. They're responsible for the segregation of duties, rule books, the reporting, and the configuration of the access there. When actually it's business risk that are addressing, but they can't get the ownership out where it needs to be. And there's not enough emphasis placed on that as part of their risk and control matrices. I'm not surprised that IT own this or are responsible for it. It's good to see a good mix of InfoSec in there, because I think you need that sort of risk-based approach to these elements. I would like to see some increase in business ownership of these elements to really get the priority where it needs to be.
Yeah, I think there's a realization that ERP is now a blind spot, and that's been addressed. And like I say, it is IT who will address that based on their traditional infrastructure focus. But it's a chance again to bring together ERP and enterprise IT security efforts together into one and working very closely together.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you both very much for walking through those with me. Some really interesting insights, and we'll be publishing the full findings in the weeks and months to come. So everybody can take a look at what we think it means for the industry and make their own conclusions as well. Hopefully they found this session useful. I wanted to mention quickly that we have another online forum coming up from Turnkey, which is our IRM, Integrated Risk Management Forum, which is in April. Registrations are open for that. Mel, John, thank you so much for coming along.
Thanks for having us.
We've got a few minutes to take a look if there's any questions that have been raised.
Yeah, there's a few. Can you?
I can't see them. Yeah, pleasure, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, John. Mel, are you able to see the questions?
I am, yes. Can you not? That's okay. So we had one that came into the chat first. What risk and control frameworks that go beyond the standard COBIT, IT general controls, base controls, would you recommend for delving into the detail for security risks and controls for SAP environments?
That's a really good one.
That's a really good one.
I'm a big fan, John alluded to it earlier, I'm a big fan of NIST because I find it simple for my brain to understand. I think it works as a methodology and as a framework to identify where your risks, the assets that those apply to, and really catalog those effectively and then protect against those risks. Then start to look at your detection of where those controls are failing and your response to those scenarios and how you recover from a failure. I think that's a really simple methodology to follow. And I think it also describes quite a good maturity curve. Most of our customers start with no ability to identify these risks, no vulnerability management programs in place. We saw that in the survey. And they slowly, as they get more mature, hit those proactive detect and automated response scenarios. So if you think in terms of like the Anapsys platform, System Profiler tells you that you've got a vulnerability, but as you start to adopt the later stage elements, you've got a much more proactive and real-time management of those vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So another one here, would you say there is a need for us to review Anapsys code going into SAP systems? I like this one.
That's a really good question. I mean, it's third-party code. What I would say is you guys are fully SAP certified and reviewed, but
yeah, I mean we're an endorsed partner for security and compliance. You know, we have to go through several checks and loops and things ourselves. You know, we have our own kind of means to assess and address coding issues. But certainly, I mean, if you think, you know, we're going through and making sure that the coding it has no issues from that side of things. Effectively, you know, I think it's a reduced issue with our code going in.
Yeah. Excellent. That's a good question though. I like that one.
It was nice. I liked that. So another here is, how reliable is SAP ATC Code Inspector in your opinion?
I think it's perfectly fine, to be honest. I'd rather see people using it than not. I think it simplifies the process of code inspection. I think it stacks up against some solutions. I think they are playing catch up a little bit. I think there are third-party solutions that are slightly ahead of the game on this and slightly better at dealing with those. But if you've not got anything in place, I think it's a perfectly viable solution.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the next question, it says, we're expanding our cloud application environments with SAP like Ariba and Concur, who supply SOC reports to them. Should they trust these implicitly, or should they be doing their own independent monitoring of vulnerability and security risks with these applications? Again, another great question, because, you know, third-party involvements like these, there is a huge I guess really this comes down to me mainly for visibility management and control. You know, if it's a service and things like that, then, you know, how much do they trust in that service? How much do they need to report on those third parties being involved? Are they safe? You know, it's the same as what you said earlier. You have access to so many systems. You know, what happens if you got compromised, and therefore you have that same effect. It's not necessarily just a trust-based situation, it's also a risk-based situation. Do you have every route covered, and can you check that?
Yeah, and a good quality third-party provider will give you good quality reporting, and they'll show you that they test those reports as well.
Yeah.
But I'm slightly paranoid, so I would always want some independent verification over those SOC reports. How you manage that with your suppliers is always your business. I've certainly been engaged to take a look at SOC reports on behalf of clients, just to say, do you think they're covering everything they need to, or is this a bare minimum? It's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess coming from you guys provide services in the same way, don't you? So, you know, to have that trust base, but to be able to prove your value, your security, your worth within that is important.
Absolutely.
So another here, what are the most common SAP interfaces security risk, and how do we check whether the interfaces are securely configured?
Ooh,
tough one.
So most common is a tricky one to answer. I would say that the most ill configured that I see recently, especially with the S4, is people not understanding how to secure the web interface authorizations with the backend S4 systems. So there's a lot of stars in SRFC, there's a lot of stars in S program and S service and S start, which is similar to your sort of T-code authorizations if you're a little bit more old school. And they've not necessarily understood how they need to add services into a role to correctly configure those. And that then opens up a lot of those sort of cross-site scripting or injection attacks that can execute RFC modules or remote function calls remotely. So a lot of the external vulnerabilities that we see can be exploited because people haven't necessarily understood that the authorization concept has changed slightly as you move into those interface environments. John, you've probably got 1,000 examples. Which do you think is most common?
There's it's quite an old one, is the message servers not secured with ACLs correctly, and now there's encryption available for that rather than using the traditional method of ACLs. So yeah, that's what we see quite commonly still, and it's quite an old exploit.
Excellent. I'm conscious we're running out of time. Have we got many more questions, Mel? Or
maybe we should respond to some of these via email after the event, then, because there are a few more actually, quite a few.
Yeah, there's a couple. Yeah, so I mean, there's a question here about how many they have so many SAP systems in the landscape. How do we prioritize which ones to monitor first?
So that one's quite easy. Which is your biggest risk? Map your risks onto your applications. Coming back to the NIST piece that we talked about, identify your risk profile. So which have got your critical data in there, and which ones will have the greatest impact if they're breached. Prioritize those first, and then take that as a templated approach to the downstream systems from there. Because once you've done it on your most important one, you've got those processes and procedures in place. It's easier to do the lower risk systems. Yeah,
agreed. There's also what tools can I use to review logs more efficiently? Manual, you're correct, is very labor intensive.
There are plenty of tools out there. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Anapsys can help you with that. There are others available. Even your standard SIEM solutions will have pattern analysis. They don't necessarily interrogate SAP particularly effectively at the moment, but they're getting there. There are machine learning tools out there, but the key thing is find a partner who understands SAP and knows how to build those patterns for you. There's about 37 different logs that SAP will export by default, and that's a lot of data to have to sift through without some sort of pattern analysis in place.
Absolutely. So another very quick one, realistically, is it actually possible to manage a manual vulnerability program with internal resources? I would like to say, yeah, I mean, eventually it will be, but by the time you reviewed and finished it all, you'll be back to the beginning and starting again. Also, you have to deal with, you know, human error, things like that. You know, can you go through and be as stringent or strict as an automated process? No.
Yeah, yeah, it's about the effectiveness of that. I used to sit in the doers chair on the client side, and I used to hate when auditors would come along and say, "Can you provide me all of your system logs to show that the system hasn't been opened, etc." It is a painstaking process. Back when I was doing it, a lot of these tools weren't available to help me automate that, or to get alerted when a system was opened for changes or whatever. It is possible manually, you know, with enough pairs of hands, you can do anything. It's about making the most effective use of your time as security or risk and control owners. There are better things you could be spending your time doing than manually reviewing configuration settings in SAP systems, especially when tooling can help you do it in seconds, not weeks.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's one more. Use of baddie in custom code make things more difficult, as very often the build and check balance in SAP transaction codes are not lost. How should this be addressed?
Ooh.
Maybe a long one.
Yeah, I mean, the full answer is a little bit more complex than I can probably get into here, but baddies are really handy little packages that you have to be very careful how you use. The same way that I'm a big fan of coding authority checks as function modules that can be called from anywhere, so that you've only got to code once. You still got to look at your use cases. I think that's probably one that John can answer more effectively than me. But it would probably be one where we need to come back to you on email.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time as well. So thanks, Tom. Thanks, Mel. That's been really good.
Yeah, I knew it would be a good session. So thanks.
We have overrun, so thank you again for attending. Really interesting. I hope it's been insightful for those who attended, and thank you, everybody.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.